She took the blame for a crime she didn't commit. Then her boss proposed a deal she couldn't ignore. Olivia Reed had spent years building a life that, while far from easy, was at least stable. She had learned to navigate the ruthless corporate world, carefully balancing her responsibilities as an assistant to one of the most feared billionaires in the country, Alexander Grayson. The man was known for his cold, calculating nature, a business tycoon who ran his empire with an iron fist and showed no patience for mistakes. Olivia had seen people crumble under the pressure of working for him, but she had survived. Not because she was fearless, far from it. She simply had no other choice. With her younger brother Noah depending on her, she had learned to endure anything. Long hours, impossible expectations, harsh words that cut deep. None of it mattered as long as she could provide for him. Noah had always been the one bright spot in her life. His laughter a reminder that the sacrifices were worth it. She had promised him a future, one where his medical condition wouldn't hold him back, where he could pursue his dreams without worrying about hospital bills and endless treatments. That promise kept her going, even when the weight of her job threatened to crush her. Tonight was supposed to be like any other. The office was quiet, most of the employees already gone, but Olivia had stayed late, as she often did. The soft glow of her computer screen was the only source of light in the dimly lit room, casting a shadow over her exhausted face. She rubbed her temples, trying to focus on the endless stream of numbers on her screen. Another late night, another file to double-check, another report to finalize before morning. Then, everything changed. Her phone buzzed, the sharp vibration breaking the silence. Frowning, she reached for it, expecting another reminder about an early morning meeting. But the moment she saw the message on the screen, a chill ran down her spine. "Olivia, something's wrong. You need to get out of there." Her heart pounded as she reread the text. It was from a coworker, someone she barely spoke to, and yet the urgency in those few words sent a wave of unease through her. She barely had time to process it before the elevator dinged, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. Seconds later, the door burst open. Security guards stormed in, their faces set in grim determination. Behind them, Alexander Grayson himself stood tall, his piercing gaze locked onto her. For a moment, Olivia couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. She had seen Alexander angry before, had been on the receiving end of his impatience, but this was different. This was fury. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but the storm in his eyes was unmistakable. "Check her system," he ordered. One of the guards moved to her desk, clicking through her files, while another held out a printed document. Olivia's stomach twisted as she saw her name at the bottom of the page, next to a signature she didn't remember writing. "Miss Reed," one of the men said, "we have reason to believe you've been involved in the embezzlement of company funds." The words barely registered. Olivia shook her head, her pulse hammering in her ears. "That's not possible." Alexander's gaze didn't waver. "Then explain this," he said coldly, tossing a folder onto her desk. She hesitated before opening it, her fingers trembling. The moment she saw the documents inside, a wave of nausea hit her. Bank transactions, confidential emails, signatures, everything pointed to her. It was her login credentials, her computer, her authorization codes. "I didn't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "I swear I didn't." "Enough." Alexander's voice was like ice. "Everything leads back to you. Tell me, Olivia, how long have you been stealing from me?" The accusation sliced through her like a blade. The disbelief in his voice, the absolute certainty that she was guilty, it was too much. She had spent years proving herself, giving everything to this job, and yet in an instant, he believed the worst of her. "I wouldn't," she started, but her voice cracked, the lump in her throat growing too thick to swallow. "Save it." His expression darkened. "You will pay for this." Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This had to be a mistake. Someone had set her up. But who? And why? Before she could gather her thoughts, the guards moved toward her. "You're coming with us, Miss Reed." "No, wait." Her voice rose in panic. You don't understand. I didn't take her. Alexander's command was final. Cold hands gripped her arms, dragging her toward the door. She struggled, twisting to face him one last time. Alexander, please, she pleaded, her voice raw. You know me. You know I wouldn't do this. For a moment, something flickered in his gaze. Doubt, hesitation. But just as quickly, it disappeared, replaced by the ruthless mask he always wore. I don't know you at all, he said. And with that, the last bit of hope inside her shattered. Olivia's world blurred as the guards pulled her out of the office, her heels scraping against the polished marble floors. The once familiar hallways of Grayson Enterprises now felt like a prison, closing in around her with every step. She could barely process what was happening. One moment, she had been working late as always, and the next, she was being dragged away like a criminal. Her heart pounded so loudly in her chest that it drowned out the murmurs of the few remaining employees who had stayed behind. Some whispered behind their hands, their eyes filled with shock. Others averted their gazes, as if watching her downfall would bring bad luck upon them. But none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was proving her innocence. Please, you have to believe me, Olivia begged, twisting against the grip of the security officers. I didn't take anything. I would never do this. Neither of the men responded. Their expressions were unreadable, their movements robotic. It didn't matter what she said. Her fate had already been decided. Then, just as they reached the elevator, she saw him. Alexander stood at the far end of the hallway, his broad shoulders tense, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was watching her, his dark eyes unreadable, his face carved from stone. For a second, she thought she saw something flicker in his gaze. Hesitation, regret, doubt. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the cold, ruthless man she had worked under for years. Alexander, please, she tried again, her voice cracking. You know me. You know I wouldn't. I knew who I thought you were. He interrupted, his tone devoid of warmth. Clearly, I was wrong. His words cut deeper than she expected. She had always known he wasn't the type to trust easily, but to throw her away like this, to believe she was capable of betraying him after everything she had sacrificed, it was unbearable. The elevator doors slid open with a soft ding, and she was shoved inside. The moment the cold metal doors closed in front of her, sealing her away from the only life she had ever known, Olivia felt the first tear slip down her cheek. The night air was sharp and biting as Olivia stumbled out of the building. The security guards had released her the moment they reached the front entrance, their job done. But her nightmare was far from over. She wrapped her arms around herself, her thin blazer doing little to shield her from the cold. The city that had once felt like home now felt hostile, unforgiving. It had swallowed her whole, and now it was spitting her out like she was nothing. Her hand shook as she pulled out her phone. She had one missed call from Noah. Her stomach clenched. Noah. For a moment, she had almost forgotten about him in the chaos of her own downfall. She pressed the call button with trembling fingers, her breath uneven as she waited for him to pick up. It only rang twice before his voice filled the silence. Olivia. His voice was laced with worry, and guilt clawed at her chest. She cleared her throat, tried to steady herself. Hey, Noah. I'm on my way home. There was a pause. Are you okay? No, she wasn't. But she couldn't let him hear the pain in her voice. He had enough to worry about. Yeah, she lied. Just tired. Are you sure? She forced a laugh. Positive. I'll see you soon, okay? Another pause. Then finally, okay. As the call ended, Olivia took a shaky breath. She had no idea how she was going to tell him what had happened. How could she tell him that she had lost the job that had been keeping them afloat? That she had no idea how they were going to pay for his next hospital bill? Panic threatened to consume her, but she swallowed it down. One problem at a time. For now, she just needed to get home. The apartment she shared with Noah was small, barely big enough for the two of them, but it was warm and safe. At least, it had been. As Olivia stepped inside, her exhaustion hit her all at once. Noah was waiting for her in the living room, his legs curled up under him on the worn-out couch. His brown eyes, so much like hers, search her face the moment she walked in. "You're late," he said softly. Olivia managed a weak smile as she set her bag down. "I know. Sorry." He frowned. "Did something happen?" She hesitated. Lying to him felt wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. Not yet. "It's nothing," she said quickly. "Just a rough day at work." Noah didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Instead, he patted the space beside him on the couch. "Come sit. I saved you some food." Her heart ached at his kindness. Even when he wasn't feeling well, he still worried about her. She forced herself to move, to sit beside him, to pretend that everything was fine. But as the night wore on, the weight of reality settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She had lost everything, and she had no idea how to fix it. The next morning, Olivia woke up to the sound of a knock on the door. She groggily pushed herself up, rubbing at her tired eyes. A glance at the clock told her it was barely 7. Who could it be at this hour? With a sense of unease curling in her stomach, she pulled on a sweater and made her way to the door. The moment she opened it, she froze. Standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable, was Alexander Grayson. Her breath caught in her throat. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. For the first time since she had known him, he looked hesitant, almost conflicted. Then, finally he spoke. "We need to talk." The cold air bit at Olivia's skin as she was dragged out of the office building, her heels clicking against the marble floors in hurried, uneven steps. The grip on her arms was firm, almost bruising, and no amount of struggling made a difference. Her heart pounded violently, her breaths coming in short gasps as panic tightened around her chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She had spent years pouring everything she had into this job. Endless nights of exhaustion, relentless pressure, pushing herself beyond her limits. All for what? To be thrown away like a criminal without a second thought? Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here. Not in front of them. Please," she choked out as they pulled her toward the exit. "Just let me talk to him. Let me explain." But the security guards didn't even acknowledge her words. They had a job to do, and it didn't include listening to her pleas. The moment they reached the glass doors, the cold night air rushed over her, stealing the last of her breath. The city lights blurred through her unshed tears, casting a harsh glow over the sleek black car parked just outside. It was waiting for her. "No," she whispered, panic surging through her. "You don't understand. I didn't do this." She twisted against their grip, desperate to break free, but it was useless. They shoved the back door open, and before she could protest, she was forced inside. The door slammed shut. Darkness swallowed her, the tinted windows making it impossible to see the outside world clearly. The only light came from the soft glow of the street lamps, casting eerie shadows across the leather seats. Olivia barely had time to catch her breath before the other door opened. A figure slid into the seat beside her. Alexander. His presence filled the car, his sharp, commanding aura pressing down on her like an invisible weight. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. His silence was just as suffocating as his words would have been. The driver pulled away from the curb, the low hum of the engine the only sound between them. She forced herself to look at him, her vision blurred by the tears she refused to shed. His chiseled features were set in stone, his jaw clenched, his piercing eyes colder than she had ever seen them. "You had your chance to talk, Olivia." His voice was quiet, but there was no softness in it, just pure, unshakable certainty. She shook her head frantically. "Alexander, I swear I don't know how this happened. Someone must have." "Enough." The single word cut through the air like a blade. Her hands curled into fists on her lap, nails digging in her palms as frustration boiled inside her. "You know me," she said, her voice trembling with desperation. "I would never do something like this." Alexander's gaze flickered, just for a second, but then it was gone. "Do I?" he asked. "Because all the evidence says otherwise." A lump formed in her throat, making it hard to breathe. "Please," she tried again. "You have to believe me." His lips pressed into a thin line, his expression unreadable. "I don't have to do anything." The words hit harder than she expected. The man she had worked for, the man she had respected despite his ruthless nature, was looking at her like she was nothing more than a stain on his perfectly curated life. Betrayal twisted inside her. She had been loyal. She had sacrificed. And yet, the moment something went wrong, he had turned on her without hesitation. She swallowed the bitterness rising in her throat. "Where are you taking me?" Alexander leaned back against the seat, his fingers tapping against his knee in slow, calculated movements. "You should be grateful I didn't hand you over to the police." Her stomach twisted. The police. The realization sent a fresh wave of fear crashing over her. If this wasn't bad enough already, it could get so much worse. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Then what are you going to do?" Alexander's gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time, there was something unreadable in his expression. "You've taken something from me, Olivia." His voice was quieter now, but no less dangerous. "And I always collect my debts." A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't just about punishing her. This was personal. He wasn't sending her to prison. He was going to make her pay another way. The car slowed as they pulled into an unfamiliar driveway. Olivia's breath caught as she turned to the window. A massive mansion loomed before her, its towering presence a stark contrast to the cramped apartment she called home. The iron gates closed behind them with a resounding clang, trapping her inside. Panic clawed at her chest. "Why are we here?" she asked, her voice barely steady. Alexander didn't answer right away. He simply reached for the door handle and stepped out, leaving her no choice but to follow. Her legs felt weak as she climbed out of the car, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She turned to face him, her heart pounding. "Tell me what this is about," she demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. Alexander stepped closer, his gaze unreadable. "You stole from me, Olivia." His voice was calm, too calm. "And until you pay me back, you belong to me." Her blood turned to ice. "Belong to you?" she echoed, barely able to process the words. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering his next move. "You will stay here, under my roof, under my rules, until I decide you've repaid what you owe." The ground beneath her seemed to shift. He wasn't just taking her job away. He was taking her freedom. Her hands trembled at her sides, her mind racing. This couldn't be happening. She opened her mouth to argue, to fight back, but one look at him told her it would be useless. Alexander Grayson had made up his mind, and he never changed his mind. Olivia's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, the walls of the estate seeming to close in around her. She was trapped, and there was nothing she could do about it. The heavy doors of the mansion shut behind Olivia with a resounding finality, sealing her fate. Her breath hitched as she took in the grand foyer, its marble floors gleaming under the golden chandelier. The space was vast, cold, and unwelcoming, just like the man standing beside her. Alexander didn't speak right away. He simply shrugged off his coat and handed it to a waiting butler before turning his icy gaze on her. "Follow me." His tone was clipped, leaving no room for argument. Olivia's legs felt stiff as she forced herself to move, trailing behind him through the lavish hallways. Every step felt surreal, as if she were walking through someone else's life, one that didn't belong to her. The opulence of the house was overwhelming. Expensive paintings lined the walls. The scent of polished wood and fresh roses filled the air, and soft golden lights cast a warm glow on furniture that probably cost more than she had earned in the last 5 years. But despite its beauty, the place felt empty. Hollow, just like him. Her heart pounded as Alexander stopped in front of a large door and pushed it open. Without a word, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your room," he said simply. Her stomach clenched. "You expect me to stay here?" A slow smirk curled at the corner of his lips, but there was no humor in his eyes. "Did you think I was joking?" Anger flickered beneath her fear. "You can't just keep me here," she said, her voice steadier this time. Alexander leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his broad chest. "You're free to leave, Olivia. But the moment you walk out that door, I'll make sure the police are waiting for you." Her breath caught. He was giving her a choice, but it wasn't a choice at all. Trembling, she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. It was large, with a grand four-poster bed, dark velvet curtains, and elegant decor that screamed wealth. A fire crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the walls. It was beautiful. It was a cage. She turned back to him, her throat tightening. How long? Alexander's expression didn't change. Until I decide your debt is repaid. A lump formed in her throat. This wasn't about money. It never had been. He was punishing her for a crime she hadn't even committed. She swallowed hard, refusing to let him see her break. And if I refuse? His gaze darkened, his jaw tightening. Then you face the consequences. Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Olivia clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. She hated this. She hated him, but she hated the thought of being dragged to prison even more. After a long pause, she lifted her chin. Fine, she said, forcing the word through gritted teeth. But don't expect me to make this easy for you. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. Oh, I wouldn't dream of it. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The moment she was alone, Olivia's legs gave out, and she sank onto the edge of the bed. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her face, trying to steady her breathing. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. She had worked so hard, fought so long to build a life for herself, and in a single night, everything had crumbled. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't cry. Not for him. Not for this. But as she sat there, trapped in a world that wasn't hers, one terrifying thought consumed her. How far was Alexander willing to go to make her pay? The night stretched on in unbearable silence, interrupted only by the soft crackling of the fireplace. Olivia sat frozen on the edge of the massive bed, her fingers gripping the silk sheets as if they could somehow anchor her in reality. Her mind raced, trying to piece together how everything had unraveled so quickly. Only hours ago, she had been in control of her life. Now, she was trapped in a mansion with a man who saw her as nothing more than a pawn in his cruel game. Her throat burned as she swallowed back her emotions. She wouldn't break. Not here. Not now. Pushing herself to her feet, she crossed the room, pacing in slow, restless strides. The space was suffocating, no matter how luxurious it appeared. She walked to the large window and pulled back the heavy curtains. The view of the vast estate was breathtaking. Manicured gardens stretched out beneath the moonlight, their beauty untouched by the storm raging inside her. For a fleeting moment, she considered running. But where would she go? Even if she managed to slip past security, Alexander had made it painfully clear that he wouldn't let her go unpunished. The weight of his threat hung over her like a noose. A soft knock at the door made her heart lurch. She turned sharply as the door creaked open. A middle-aged woman stepped inside, her expression unreadable. She wore a neat uniform, her posture stiff with professionalism. "Miss Olivia," she said in a gentle yet firm tone, "Mr. Whitmore has asked me to bring you something to eat." Olivia's stomach twisted. She hadn't realized how empty she felt until now. The woman set a silver tray on a small table near the fireplace. The aroma of warm bread and roasted vegetables filled the room, making Olivia's stomach churn with hunger. "I'm Margaret," the woman continued, her gaze softening as she observed Olivia's hesitance. "If you need anything, you can call for me." Olivia's eyes darted to the tray, then back to the woman. "Did he send you to watch me?" Margaret sighed, folding her hands in front of her. "I've worked in this house for many years. Mr. Whitmore isn't an easy man, but he has his reasons." Olivia let out a bitter laugh. "His reasons? You mean his need to control and punish people?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. "I won't tell you what to think of him," she said instead. "But I will tell you this. There's more to this house than what you see on the surface." Olivia frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. "Eat while the food is warm. It's going to be a long night." Without another word, she turned and left, shutting the door softly behind her. Olivia stared after her, unease prickling her skin. There was something unsettling about Margaret's words, as if she had been warning Olivia of something much bigger than she realized. She exhaled sharply, shaking off the thought. It didn't matter. Nothing about this situation made sense, but one thing was clear: she was on her own. Slowly, she approached the tray and sank into the chair beside it. The smell of the food was tempting, but she hesitated before taking a bite. A ridiculous part of her wondered if Alexander had ordered the food as another form of manipulation, but she pushed the thought away. Starving herself wouldn't solve anything. She picked up a piece of bread and took a small bite. The warmth spread through her, easing the tension in her chest just a little. But even as she ate, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something she wasn't prepared for. Morning arrived too soon. Olivia had barely slept, her mind a tangled mess of thoughts and fears. The unfamiliar bed had felt like a prison, and the knowledge that she was trapped in this house made every breath feel heavier. She forced herself to rise, her body aching from exhaustion. The morning light streamed through the curtains, casting golden hues across the room, but there was no warmth in it. A knock at the door made her stiffen. "Miss Olivia." Margaret's voice carried through the wood. Olivia hesitated before stepping forward and opening the door. Margaret's expression was calm, but there was a flicker of urgency in her eyes. "Mr. Whitmore has requested your presence at breakfast." Olivia's stomach tightened. "What?" Margaret hesitated before responding. "It's best not to keep him waiting." A chill ran through Olivia's spine. Margaret stepped aside, waiting for her to follow. With a deep breath, Olivia straightened her shoulders and stepped out into the hallway. The house was eerily quiet as Margaret led her through the grand corridors. Expensive paintings lined the walls, and every surface gleamed under the soft morning light. But no matter how beautiful the surroundings were, they couldn't mask the coldness that lingered in the air. As they approached the dining room, Olivia's pulse quickened. Margaret stopped at the entrance and nodded toward the inside. "Go on." Olivia swallowed hard before stepping inside. The dining room was massive, with tall windows overlooking the vast estate. A long table stretched through the center of the room, set with delicate china and silverware. And at the head of the table sat Alexander. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Sit," he instructed. Olivia's legs felt heavy as she walked to the chair opposite him and lowered herself onto the seat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She hated the way his gaze lingered on her, as if he were waiting for her to break. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. "You didn't try to run." Olivia's jaw clenched. "Would it have made a difference if I did?" A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "No." The casual way he said it made her blood boil. "I don't know what game you're playing," she said, her voice steady despite the anger rising in her chest. "But I'm not a pawn." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Aren't you?" She stiffened. He reached for his coffee cup, taking a slow sip before setting it down. "You can fight all you want, Olivia. It won't change the fact that you're here under my terms." Her hands curled into fists beneath the table. She refused to let him see how much his words rattled her. Forcing herself to remain calm, she picked up her fork and stabbed a piece of fruit. If he expected her to cower, he would be disappointed. She wasn't going to surrender that easily. Alexander watched her for a long moment, amusement flickering in his cold eyes. "Good," he murmured, almost to himself. "You're stronger than I expected." His words unsettled her, but she refused to let them show. Instead, she met his gaze head-on. With a sharp breath, she turned back to the shelves, running her fingers over the smooth spines of the books. If she was trapped here, she might as well find something to distract herself. Pulling out an old leather-bound novel, she sank into one of the oversized chairs near the window. But no matter how much she tried to focus on the words in front of her, her mind kept replaying the events of the past 24 hours. How had her life changed so drastically in such a short time? Her fingers clenched around the book. Alexander Whitmore was a ruthless man, that much was clear. But there had been something else in his eyes earlier, a shadow of something deeper, something almost broken. "No." She shook her head, as if physically rejecting the thought. Whatever his past was, it wasn't her concern. Her priority was figuring out a way to leave. Her gaze drifted to the large windows. The estate was vast, stretching out in endless acres of perfectly manicured gardens and stone pathways. Tall iron gates loomed in the distance, and beyond them, the world she had been forced to leave behind. She needed a plan, a way to escape. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. She tensed, setting the book down just as the library doors opened. Margaret entered, carrying a tray with tea and biscuits. The older woman's expression was neutral, but there was something in her eyes that made Olivia pause. "You've been in here for hours," Margaret said, setting the tray down on a small table beside her. "I thought you might be hungry." Olivia hesitated. She had learned not to trust kindness so easily. Still, she reached for the tea, the warmth of the cup comforting against her cold fingers. "Thank you." Margaret sat down in the chair across from her, folding her hands neatly in her lap. For a moment, she simply watched Olivia, as if debating whether to say what was on her mind. Finally, she sighed. "I know what you're thinking." Olivia arched an eyebrow. "Do you?" Margaret nodded. "You're planning your escape." Olivia's grip on the teacup tightened slightly, but she said nothing. Margaret sighed again, shaking her head. "You wouldn't be the first." A cold knot formed in Olivia's stomach, and Margaret's expression darkened. No one has succeeded. The weight of her words settled over Olivia like a heavy chain. She swallowed hard. "So what are you saying? That I should just accept this?" "I'm saying," Margaret said carefully, "that if you want to survive here, you need to be smart. You need to understand the man you're dealing with." Olivia's heart pounded. "And what do you understand about him?" Margaret hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "I've worked for Mr. Whitmore for many years. I've seen sides of him that most people haven't." Olivia leaned forward slightly. "And what side is that?" Margaret studied her for a long moment before responding. "A man who has lost more than he lets on." Olivia frowned. "Lost?" Margaret shook her head. "That's all I'll say for now." She stood, smoothing out the wrinkles in her dress. "Be careful, Miss Olivia. This house has a way of changing people." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Olivia alone once again. She exhaled slowly, trying to process everything. Alexander was a man who thrived on control, yet there was something fractured beneath his cold exterior. And now, even Margaret was warning her to tread carefully. But Olivia wasn't like the others. She wouldn't sit here and accept her fate. No matter what it took, she would find a way out. The hours passed slowly after Margaret left, but Olivia's mind refused to rest. She paced the library, her thoughts racing as she replayed every word Margaret had said. No one has succeeded. That sentence had been meant to scare her, to make her believe there was no way out. But Olivia wasn't the type to surrender to fear. Still, she needed more information. She needed to understand what she was truly up against. With a determined breath, she strode out of the library and into the dimly lit hallway. The estate was massive, and she had barely seen a fraction of it. Servants moved through the corridors quietly, their eyes never lingering on her for too long. She didn't know if they feared Alexander or if they had simply accepted their place in his world. Olivia wasn't ready to do either. She walked with purpose, taking mental notes of every hallway and doorway she passed. Some led to grand rooms with towering windows, others to staircases that spiraled into darkness. Every part of the estate seemed designed to intimidate, to remind her that she didn't belong. But she didn't care about that. Her only focus was finding an exit. She reached the back of the estate and paused when she spotted a door that was slightly ajar. She glanced around, making sure no one was watching, then slipped inside. The room was different from the others she had seen. It wasn't polished or pristine. Dust clung to the heavy furniture, and old paintings lined the walls, their colors faded with time. A study. Olivia stepped forward cautiously, her eyes scanning the room for anything useful. Her gaze landed on a large oak desk in the corner. Slowly, she approached it, her fingers hovering over the surface before she hesitantly pulled open one of the drawers. Inside, there were stacks of documents neatly organized. Most were financial records, names of companies and transactions she didn't understand. But then her fingers brushed against something different, something old. A worn leather journal. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding as she pulled it out and opened it. The handwriting was rough, the ink slightly smudged in places. It didn't take long for her to realize whose words she was reading. Alexander's. Her breath caught as she flipped through the pages, each one filled with fragmented thoughts, some angry, some broken. One entry made her fingers tremble. I swore I'd never let anyone in again. Love is a weakness. Trust is a mistake. She exhaled shakily, her mind spinning. Alexander wasn't just cruel. He was wounded. She was still trying to make sense of it when the sound of footsteps echoed outside the door. Her stomach clenched. She shoved the journal back into the drawer and shut it just as the door swung open. Alexander stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his presence alone sent a wave of unease through her. For a long moment, he simply watched her, his gaze sharp. You're awfully curious. Olivia forced herself to remain calm, to meet his eyes without flinching. I was just looking around. His lips pressed into a thin line. This isn't a place for wandering. Her pulse pounded, but she lifted her chin. I don't take orders well. A flicker of something, annoyance, amusement, or maybe something darker, passed through his eyes. Then that will be your downfall, he murmured. There was a threat in his tone, but Olivia refused to be intimidated. She took a slow step toward him, holding his gaze. Or maybe it will be yours. Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Olivia standing there, breathless and shaken. One thing was clear. She had just stepped into dangerous territory. Olivia stood frozen long after Alexander disappeared down the hallway. Her pulse still raced, her breath uneven. She had thought she was ready to face him, to challenge him if necessary. But standing in that dimly lit study, with his cold gaze fixed on her, she had felt something she hadn't expected. Not just fear, curiosity. There was more to Alexander Whitmore than the ruthless, unfeeling man the world believed him to be. His journal had proved that. His words, scrawled across the pages, were raw and filled with the pain he hid behind his brutal exterior. But why? What had happened to make him so determined to shut out the world? She didn't know if finding out would help her escape, but something told her that understanding him might be the only way to survive here. Taking a steadying breath, she turned and left the study, her mind still tangled with thoughts. The hallway stretched before her, its silence unnerving. She had barely taken a few steps when she spotted Margaret standing near the grand staircase. The older woman's sharp eyes landed on Olivia, and in an instant she knew. Margaret knew where she had been. But instead of scolding her, the housekeeper simply motioned for Olivia to follow her. With a reluctant sigh, Olivia complied. They walked through the estate in silence until they reached the back of the mansion, where the servants' quarters were located. The space was simpler than the rest of the house. Plain wooden furniture, dim lighting, and the faint scent of fresh bread lingering in the air. Margaret finally stopped near a small, unoccupied sitting area. She turned to Olivia, her gaze unreadable. "You should be careful where you wander," she said, her voice calm but firm. Olivia met her eyes. "And if I don't want to be careful?" A flicker of something, pity, maybe even concern, passed over Margaret's face. "Then you will learn the hard way, just like the others." Olivia frowned. The others? Margaret let out a slow breath and took a seat on a worn armchair. "You're not the first woman to challenge Alexander, and you won't be the last." Olivia's stomach tightened. What happened to them? Margaret hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. Some left, some were sent away, and some. Her voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Some hadn't been so lucky. Olivia swallowed hard. "And yet, you're warning me instead of telling Alexander what I was doing in his study." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because I've seen what happens when people underestimate him." Olivia sat down across from her, her voice quieter now. "Then why stay here? Why work for him if you know what kind of man he is?" Margaret looked away, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Because not all monsters are born. Some are made." The weight of those words settled heavily in Olivia's chest. She wanted to press further, to demand answers, but Margaret rose to her feet before she could speak again. Stay out of his way, Olivia. If you want to leave here unharmed, stop pushing him. And with that, she walked away, leaving Olivia alone with more questions than answers. The next morning, Olivia woke to the sound of knocking. She groaned, sitting up as the heavy wooden door creaked open. A maid stepped inside, her expression stiff. "Mr. Whitmore wants to see you in his office," she said quickly, before turning and disappearing down the hall. Olivia sighed. She had barely had time to process everything from the night before, and now she was being summoned. Dressing quickly, she made her way through the mansion. When she reached Alexander's office, she hesitated before knocking. "Come in," his voice called from inside. Taking a breath, she pushed open the door. Alexander sat behind his massive desk, looking over a document. His dark eyes lifted to hers, unreadable as always. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. He set down the paper and leaned back in his chair. "I assume Margaret already warned you about wandering where you don't belong." Olivia didn't answer. His gaze darkened. "I don't like disobedience." "Then fire me," she shot back before she could stop herself. A slow, humorless smile touched his lips. "You think it's that simple?" Her fingers curled into fists. "I don't belong here. You know that. So why keep me?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he stood and walked around the desk, stopping just a few feet from her. "You want the truth?" he murmured. She lifted her chin. "I do." He studied her, as if deciding how much to reveal. Then, finally, he spoke. "You intrigue me, Olivia. You're not like the others. And that makes me curious." Her heart pounded. Curious about what? His gaze never wavered. "About how long you'll last before you break." A shiver ran down her spine. This wasn't just about keeping her here. This was a test. And she had just become his newest game. Olivia's breath hitched at Alexander's words, but she refused to let him see the effect they had on her. She squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze with quiet defiance. "I'm not some game," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. Alexander tilted his head, observing her like a predator studying its prey. "Aren't you?" he murmured. "You're here, trapped in my world, with no way out unless I say so. That makes you a piece on my board, whether you like it or not." Olivia clenched her fists. "And what if I refuse to play?" His lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "Then I'll just have to see how long you last before you beg to." A chill ran down her spine, but she refused to show weakness. Instead, she took a step closer, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "You don't scare me," she lied. His amusement deepened, but something else flickered in his eyes, something she couldn't quite name. "We'll see," he said softly. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Then, as if bored with the conversation, Alexander turned and walked back to his desk. He picked up the papers he had been reading earlier, flipping through them with practiced ease. "You can go," he said without looking at her. Olivia hesitated. Part of her wanted to demand answers, to make him tell her why he was keeping her here. But she knew it would be useless. He enjoyed being in control too much. So, instead, she turned and left, her mind racing with questions she had no way of answering. For the next few days, Olivia did her best to avoid Alexander. She kept her head down, focused on her work, and stayed within the parts of the estate she was allowed to be in. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she passed the grand staircase, she felt his presence. Even when she couldn't see him, she knew he was there, somewhere in the shadows, observing her, waiting for her to slip up. It was suffocating, and yet, she couldn't deny that part of her was drawn to the mystery of him. Margaret's words haunted her. Not all monsters are born. Some are made. What had happened to make him this way? Late one evening, after finishing her tasks, she wandered onto the balcony overlooking the vast gardens. The night air was cool against her skin, and for the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe. But her peace was short-lived. "You're not very good at following orders." The deep voice sent a shiver down her spine. She turned sharply to find Alexander leaning against the doorway, watching her with that unreadable expression. Olivia tensed. "I didn't realize stepping outside was against the rules." He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "It isn't," he said, stopping just a few feet away. "But I can't decide if you're being careful or if you're testing me." Her heart pounded, but she refused to look away. "Maybe I just don't want to be afraid of you." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, surprise, maybe even curiosity. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "Fear keeps people alive, Olivia," he murmured. "You should remember that." She swallowed, her throat dry. "And what about you?" His brows lifted slightly. "What about me?" She took a breath, gathering her courage. "Are you afraid of anything?" For the first time, Alexander didn't answer immediately. Something shifted in his expression, just for a moment. A shadow of something deeper, something darker. But then, just as quickly, he masked it with his usual indifference. "I don't have that luxury," he said simply. Olivia studied him, searching for cracks in the walls he had built around himself. "That sounds lonely," she said quietly. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Olivia alone in the moonlight. And for the first time, she saw it. The loneliness he tried so hard to hide. Damien stood motionless, his mind trapped between his old grudges and the undeniable pull Elena had on him. Her tear-streaked face, the raw pain in her eyes, it shattered something inside him, something he had locked away for years. But he wasn't ready to surrender, not yet. The weight of betrayal still clung to him, refusing to let go. "You think saying you love me changes anything?" His voice was low, almost dangerous, but there was a crack in it, one that Elena didn't miss. She stepped closer, her small frame trembling but determined. "It should," she whispered, "because it's the truth." Damien let out a harsh laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Truth? You really expect me to believe that? After everything?" Elena's hands balled into fists at her sides. "Yes, because I never lied to you. I never betrayed you, Damien." Her voice wavered, but didn't break. "I loved you even when you hated me. I loved you even when you made me feel like I was nothing. And I love you now, even when you're trying so hard to push me away." Silence filled the space between them, thick with emotions neither of them could fully grasp. Damien's jaw clenched. "I don't deserve that." Elena shook her head, her voice soft but steady. "You deserve love, Damien. You just don't believe it." Something in her words cracked the final barrier he had built around himself. He had spent so long consumed by revenge, by the idea of making someone pay for his pain, that he had lost sight of what really mattered. His hands clenched at his sides as he tried to fight the overwhelming emotions threatening to break him. But then he looked at her, the woman who had endured so much, who had stayed even when he had given her every reason to leave. "Say it again," he said hoarsely. Elena blinked. "What?" His gaze locked onto hers. "Say that you love me." Her lips trembled as she whispered, "I love you, Damien." And just like that, the last of his resistance crumbled. With a sharp intake of breath, Damien closed the distance between them in one swift motion, his hands cupping her face. He searched her eyes, looking for any sign of hesitation, but all he saw was truth. Then he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was raw, filled with every emotion he had buried. Anger, regret, longing, love. Elena gasped against his lips, but she didn't pull away. She kissed him back with just as much desperation, as if she, too, had been waiting for this moment. When they finally pulled apart, Damien rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "I don't know how to love, Elena," he admitted in a broken whisper. "But I want to learn. With you." Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they were tears of hope. "Then let's start over," she murmured. "Together." A slow, hesitant smile touched his lips as he nodded. Together. For the first time in years, Damien Whitmore let go of his past. And for the first time, he embraced the future with the woman who had healed his heart. The days following Damien's confession were unlike anything Elena had ever imagined. He was different, still rough around the edges, still carrying the weight of his past, but something had shifted. The cold distance he had once kept between them was gone, replaced by quiet moments of vulnerability. Yet, love alone wasn't enough to erase the damage that had been done. Their wounds, though healing, still lingered beneath the surface. One evening, as the sun set over the Whitmore estate, Damien found himself standing on the balcony, staring at the horizon. The golden light cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the conflict in his eyes. He heard soft footsteps behind him, and moments later, Elena's warm presence was beside him. "You're thinking too much," she said gently. Damien exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to fix everything, Elena. I don't even know where to begin." She turned to him, her eyes filled with understanding. "You don't have to fix everything all at once. Healing takes time." He let out a dry chuckle. "Time doesn't erase the damage I've done to you." His voice was filled with regret. "I forced you into a marriage that wasn't fair. I hurt you, made you feel like you were nothing." He turned to face her fully, his expression tight with guilt. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." Elena reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Forgiveness isn't about who deserves it, Damien. It's about choosing to move forward instead of staying trapped in the past." He studied her, his heart clenching at the sheer kindness in her eyes. How had she endured so much and still found it in her heart to love him? "I don't want to be the man I was," he admitted. "I want to be better. For you. For us." Elena smiled softly. "Then take the first step." His brows furrowed. "And what is that?" "Letting go," she whispered. "Not just of your past, but of the pain that keeps you from happiness." Her words hit him deeper than she could ever know. For years, he had lived with nothing but vengeance in his heart, convinced that it was the only thing keeping him going. But standing here, with Elena's fingers intertwined with his, he realized something. Love wasn't his weakness. It was his salvation. A slow breath left him as he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles. "Then I'll try," he murmured. "I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I'll try." Elena's eyes shimmered with warmth. "That's all I ask." Weeks passed, and the air between them grew lighter, softer. Damien no longer walked around with the weight of the world on his shoulders, and Elena found herself smiling more, laughing more. Their relationship wasn't perfect. There were still moments of hesitation, still nights when Damien struggled with his demons. But the difference now was that he let her in. One afternoon, he surprised her by taking her to the countryside, where the vast fields stretched endlessly under the golden sun. Elena stepped out of the car, her breath catching as she took in the view. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Damien stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "I bought this place a few years ago," he admitted. "Thought I'd never have a reason to come here, but now," he turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I want to build something here. A home. A real one." Elena's eyes widened as she turned to him, her heart pounding. "Damien," he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her breath hitched as he opened it, revealing a delicate ring, a simple but elegant band with a single diamond. "I don't want our marriage to be a contract anymore," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't want to be built on pain or obligation." He took a step closer, his fingers brushing against hers. "I want it to be real. Will you marry me again, Elena? This time, not because you have to, but because you want to?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she let out a shaky breath. There was no hesitation in her heart, no doubt in her soul. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. Damien's lips curved into a rare, genuine smile before he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then, with the setting sun casting a warm glow around them, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, softly, deeply, like a man who had finally found his home. And for the first time in a long time, both of them knew this was the beginning of their forever. Months passed, and with each day, Damien and Elena grew closer, their love deepening in ways neither of them had imagined. The once cold billionaire had become a man who smiled more often, who no longer hid behind the walls of his past. And Elena? She had blossomed into a woman who knew her worth, who had fought through heartbreak and pain and had come out stronger on the other side. But love was never without its challenges. One evening, as Elena stood in their newly built home, gazing out at the rolling fields, she felt a pair of strong arms wrap around her waist. Damien pressed a kiss against the side of her neck, his voice husky as he whispered, "What are you thinking about?" She leaned into his embrace, sighing softly. "About us. How far we've come." Damien turned her around, so she faced him, his intense gaze locking onto hers. "And," a small smile played on her lips, "and how I never thought I'd find a love like this." He brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Neither did I." They stood there in silence, the warmth of their bodies pressed together, their hearts beating in sync. But just as Elena felt completely at peace, she sensed the slightest hesitation in Damien. "What is it?" she asked, searching his face. He exhaled, his jaw tightening. "I got a call today from my father's lawyer." Elena's breath caught. She rarely asked about Damien's father, the man who had abandoned him, who had chosen greed over his own son. She knew how deep that wound ran, and she never wanted to force him to relive it. "What did he want?" she asked carefully. Damien's eyes darkened. "He's dying." Elena felt a pang of sadness, not for the man himself, but for the pain she knew this would bring Damien. "He wants to see me," Damien continued, his voice laced with bitterness. "After all these years, after everything he did, he wants me to come." Elena reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Do you want to go?" A muscle ticked in his jaw. "I don't know." He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "I spent my whole life hating him. I built everything I have to prove that I never needed him. And now, when he has nothing left, he suddenly remembers that he has a son." Elena cupped his face, her touch soft but firm. "Maybe this isn't about him, Damien. Maybe it's about you." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She met his gaze with quiet strength. "You've carried this anger for so long, and I understand why. But what if letting go isn't about forgiving him? What if it's about freeing yourself?" Damien stared at her for a long moment, then sighed, pulling her into his arms. "How do you always know what to say?" She smiled against his chest. "Because I know your heart, Damien. And I know that no matter how much you try to deny it, you don't want to live in the past anymore." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Then I'll go," he murmured. "Not for him, but for me." Months later, standing in the backyard of their home, Damien watched as Elena tended to the garden, her face glowing with happiness. He had spent so much of his life chasing power, believing that success would fill the void in his heart. But standing here, watching the woman he loved, he realized this was his true victory. "Elena," he called softly. She turned to him, smiling. "Yes." He stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her. "I want us to start a family." Her eyes widened in surprise before filling with warmth. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "I never thought I'd be capable of love. But you changed everything." He brushed a kiss against her forehead. "And I want to build something real with you. A future, a family." Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "Then let's do it." Damien smiled, pressing his forehead against hers. "Together." She nodded. "Together." And as the sun set behind them, casting a golden glow over their home, Damien knew this wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of the life he had always longed for.